there everybody, welcome back to my channel Boomy Reactions. My name is Boomy. Thank you for watching my lovelies. Now I would like to share a rather miscellaneous video with you again. I do love that word, miscellaneous, random. So today's video, it's about the American vintage 50s diners. So as I've said a few times, here in the UK, we've got quite the interest in diners. There's a few chains, just to mention a few, Ed's Diners. I can't remember the name of the other ones. So we've got chains over here that try and replicate the feel, the aesthetic, and the food from what we consider or what we think is American vintage diners. And I, for one, am a huge fan. I don't know how accurate this depiction of diners is, but I'm a huge fan. I love that vintage feel, you know, that really feel good, cozy kind of food. Milkshakes, oh my gosh. The food tends to be a little bit more on the greasy side, but come on guys, it's a treat, it's a comfort food, you know. So this video comes as a request from Arctic Tron, from my Patreon. Thank you very much, my friend. And Arctic Tron says, hey Boomy, this is a bit of a random recommendation for you called Architect Breaks Down Why All American Diners Look Like That. Okay, that's interesting. Which goes over the architectural style of American diners, as well as other buildings that you might not have known were birthed from that style. Ooh, I can't think off the top of my head what kind of buildings that could be. So yes, very, very interesting. So there's obviously a kind of style that goes very hand in hand with the diners, and that's maybe how some chains over here are able to replicate it. But like I say, I don't know how true that actually is. What I see on TV or films, what I think of when I think of American diners, it's very much based on film, media. So I wonder how accurate that actually is. So let's crack on with the video, guys. And as ever, if you're enjoying these reactions, please like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you very much. If you're interested, I have a Buy Me a Coffee account. The link is over here. And should you be interested in supporting this channel any further, I have a Patreon account. The link is in the description below.
Everyone knows what a classic American diner looks like, which is so recognizable that it's been exported around the world as a symbol of American culture. But why do they look that way? Hi, I'm Michael Weitzner, and I've been an architect for over 35 years. Today, we're breaking down how architecture and design elements from 3 different eras of U.S. history work together to give the classic American diner that nostalgic glow.
I would say there's definitely a color scheme that goes hand in hand with what we consider American diners. And it's normally like red and white. Sometimes there's like a kind of a turquoise and white kind of feel to it, like it's some kind of turquoisey shade of blue. Is that accurate? I don't know why we would associate those colors with American diners, or like with the 50s kind of era. I don't know. I associate it with that era, but I couldn't tell you why. I have no idea.
So let's take a look at a typical American diner. So the outside has a shape that's reminiscent of a train. In fact, that's how diners got their name. They're named after the dining car on a train. Many of the design elements in a diner are based on the necessities of dining on a train in a railroad car, like booth seating and counter seating and an open kitchen. So I like these 2 photos because they show all the elements that go into the classic American diner. On the exterior, you have that stainless steel, smooth curvature. You've got that Art Deco typography. And then on the interior, you have the checkered floor, you have the booths, you have the globes, and you have the jukebox. In the early part of the 20th century, trains were the dominant form of travel. If you look at some of the earliest diners, they were in fact actual train cars that were placed permanently on the ground. Let's take a look.
It's interesting. I never made that connection. Oh my gosh. So yes, the color scheme, that kind of almost futuristic, but in a vintage kind of way, you know, the look of like the metal from the outside, which I suppose at the time maybe that would have been seen to have been like quite futuristic, but we associate that with this vintage kind of time era now. I had no idea they were based on the dining car and trains. That's wicked. Isn't it crazy how a stereotype like just runs away with itself and it's recreated all over the world, but no one is actually really sure where it comes from, except obviously you guys, because it came from America. But it's nuts.
Look at one now. I love this photo. This is a classic American diner that takes place in an actual dining car that was just taken off the tracks and put on the ground and made into a building. You could see that it's actually a train car with the upper windows there for ventilation and the main windows here for viewing. And
That's cool.
You can see how narrow it is, which necessitated a certain kind of design. There's a counter, one row of booths, and an open kitchen.
Where did
and
the
that
check
became some of
floor
the
come from?
classic identifiable features of the American diner. So train travel peaked in the 1920s. Fewer than 10% of Americans drove a car. But by 1950, that had tripled. And unlike with trains, people in cars could stop anytime they wanted. So diners, cafes, motels, and other types of buildings that relied on people coming through their doors started to adapt their designs to people driving in cars going 40 miles an hour. They wanted to be eye-catching. And one of the most important examples of this is Googie's in Los Angeles. So here's a picture of Googie's, which is actually designed by John Lautner, who was somewhat of a famous American modernist architect who did the famous Chemosphere house, which looks like a flying saucer that landed in the Hollywood Hills. But the thing I love about this photo in particular is there's a whole style of architecture which is named after this diner called Googie's. Googie architecture was very optimistic, very exuberant. It was about abstraction and signage and brightness. What I really like about this diner is it looks like it could have been designed in the late 1980s as a deconstructivist piece of architecture with these planes that are connected by glass that almost look like they're falling down. So Googie architecture was coined by the critic Douglas Haskell, who was referring to this diner. It's about loud signs and attention-getting buildings, new sorts of forms. It takes sort of mid-century modern architecture and takes it to a different, less serious place. And it's about a sort of optimism towards the future. Started in the 1950s, that was very influenced by space age sort of technology.
I'm so glad he said this because I really inarticulately tried to describe this before. So the kind of style that we associate with diners, I think it comes from like a 1950s kind of era, doesn't it? And I imagine the style at that time was very much what they imagined future design, like futuristic themes, like space travel and things like that. And I think that had quite a lot of influence over the 50s, like architecture and designs and things like that. So I'm glad this gentleman said that because he's a lot more articulate than I am. And he's just summed up what I was trying to say.
Even though it takes its name from this building, this is actually not a prime example of it. It actually morphs into something else. And other designs took the idea of appealing to motorists even further, designing buildings in such a way that motorists didn't even have to leave their car. Let's look at some examples.
drive-thru.
Okay, this is such a cool photograph because basically what it is, very simple square building in the middle, and then it's surrounded by this circular form. And from this building, there are little conveyor belts that bring the food out to the cars. I just think that's brilliant.
That's
the building is
clever.
actually designed as a hub and spokes, which is actually sort of like a wheel, unintentional or not. And so the signage says it's better food, but not only that, it says no tipping. And that's not an instruction, that's actually a benefit that they're advertising. Hey, no waiters, no waitresses, no tipping.
But what happens if they accidentally send you out the wrong order? Like you'd have to go in anyway, right? How many times does that happen, guys? You know, you go drive-through, fast food, I'm not naming names. You go, you order, you wait in the car, it comes out, wrong order. I forgot half of it. All the time. So you've got to go in anyway.
Let's take a look at another example. So working on that hub and spoke idea is this sort of circular building, which is very Googie in that it's starting to look a little like a flying saucer or something a little space age. And what's great about this one is the cars pull right up, but they actually get served by actual people in this one. But it's still a circular building, which is sort of the most efficient way to maximize the amount of cars that can pull up to the front of your building. So basically the building sits in the middle of a parking lot so that cars could come from any direction and pull up and get served. And talk about eye-catching. Look at all that neon. Can't miss Simons. So the popularity of cars continued to increase. And with it, so did Googie-style architecture, which was meant to appeal to the car. And that sort of culminated in Las Vegas. So let's take a look at the iconic Las Vegas sign. So no one driving into Las Vegas can miss this sign. And I love this sign. There's so much going on. All it says is welcome to fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada. But within that, there's like 4 different types of typography. There's a starburst at the top. There's this amorphous chevron shape that forms the backdrop. The letters are in these circles for welcome.
It's a very exciting logo, isn't it? There, like you said, there's so much going on. The different colors, you've got the different fonts. It's designed to kind of represent the kind of the fun chaos that I imagine Las Vegas is.
Which one might read as the planets. There's the scripted fabulous, the bright red block letter Las Vegas, and then the smaller Nevada. And it all stands and is supported on this blue armature. Nothing says Googie to me like this sign. So a lot of these flourishes in Googie architecture are really very cartoony, and it almost goes hand in hand with the rise of television at the same time as the rise of the automobile. And these sort of very simple shapes and these very two-dimensional cartoony ideas are part of that. So this is probably the most iconic of those sorts of signs that are representative of Googie. But if you drive anywhere in America, especially in the 50s and 60s, there were tons of other signs for bowling alleys and motels and diners and cafes, and they're ubiquitous throughout the country, especially along the highways. As the excitement of car travel reached its zenith, people were already imagining what would come next. In 1955, for the first time, more people traveled by airplane than they did by train. That same year in 1955, the space race officially kicked off. So when Russia launched the Sputnik satellite in 1957, the space race kicked into high gear, culminating with the US landing a man on the moon in 1969. So we went from eating in a train to eating in a car, and now let's start eating in a spaceship. The theme building at LAX. This is such a cool building. Essentially, it's a flying saucer hovering in the air where you can eat. And it's supported by these 2 main arches, which are actually steel covered in stucco, although they appear to be concrete. And there's a central tower that brings you up into this sort of disc. And within that disc is the restaurant. And what's so cool about this restaurant is it gives you views in every direction. So this building also represents the evolution of sort of Googie architecture. So it takes eye-catching to a whole other level. So where the round form before was based on maximizing the amount of cars you could bring around a building, here they're staying with that round form, but they're lifting it up in the air to make it reminiscent of this sort of flying saucer, which is very much in keeping with Googie style architecture. So if this building was sort of hovering, the next building we're going to look at really takes off. And that's the Space Needle in Seattle.
Oh,
so this is sort of the tallest example that there is of Googie architecture. It continues with that sort of cartoon theme of this flying saucer sort of taking off, and it's very reminiscent of the Jetsons and what they would do in that famous cartoon. But I like that it's got this huge armature with these sort of curvilinear shapes, and it's got one disc sort of low to the ground, and this other set of discs really high where people eat and get a whole view of the city. And it sort of represents springing into the air, this whole idea of space travel, where the impossible becomes possible. This is what the future could be. Let's build it now. So although it appears to be very optimistic and very forward-thinking, for me there was always sort of a level of dystopia involved in these buildings hovering so high, as if the Earth had been destroyed and the only place to go was up. In 1964, the world came to Flushing Meadow in Queens, in New York City. And I think it was the highest point that this style of architecture would reach. And you can see, again, this sort of idea of the hovering spaceship, this mechanized architecture where it sort of plugs in, and you can see the towers that hover above, like we saw, that were just reminiscent of the Space Needle and the theme building. This was the last time this sort of architecture, which was so forward and so exuberant, it sort of ended here. So the 1964 World's Fair was all about technology and the optimism of the future and what could be. And then it all came crashing down. That sense of the optimism for the future and the patriotism ubiquitous in the space race came back to Earth with the rise of the Vietnam War and the fight for civil rights and the assassinations. And all of a sudden, the only parts of Googie architecture that sort of remained were the diners and the eateries that had started it. And the Googie style Once a vision of the future became a thing of the past. So today when we see a retro diner and we think of it as a specific time in the 1950s, it's really an amalgam of architecture from the 1920s based on the train, the 1950s based on the car, the 1960s based on space travel, and it's sort of this mashup altogether of all those eras. So to eat in a diner is to experience an expression of some of the best parts of our shared history, our optimism for the future. But in reality, it skips over many of the lowlights that were also present, such as the Great Depression, World War II, segregation, and the Vietnam War. What I love about diners is that familiar menu. They all serve the same stuff. Breakfast and hamburgers. I mean, that's basically it throughout the entire country. And there's something so comforting that you could go to a diner anywhere across the US and know what's gonna be on the menu. What do you order? Let me know where your favorite diner is in the comments below.
Pancakes. I didn't even need the time to think about my answer. Pancakes. I wonder how similar our diners are. Because the diners that we have over here, that more often than not, they're chain restaurants, but they're intended to mimic your diners. And that's why we love them, because they're so American. For us, they are like the embodiment of a gone by era of like American dining, like from the 1950s. I think that's why we love them so much, because they're so retro, vintage, and there's something really nostalgic about them that's really, really lovable and comforting. So I wonder, they've got to be similar, haven't they? So in our diners, we would, let me think, it's burgers and hot dogs in Ed's Diner. Waffles, pancakes, milkshakes. Got to have milkshakes. Sodas. Like all these weird and wonderful, lovely flavors of sodas. I don't think there's any. Breakfasts, like eggs and bacon. So that's our diners attempting to be like American diners. How close is it? Is there anything that we're missing? Coffee, obviously, drip coffee. I think that's everything. So guys, let me know how close is what I'm describing to your diners. It's got to be close, hasn't it, guys? It's got to be. We're trying to imitate them. But yes, there is something very comforting about the sight of a diner. But now I'm actually thinking how accurate is the architecture and the buildings and even the decor on the insides. Basically, is what we think of as an American diner. How true is that? You know, do you know what I mean? You know, the seating booths, and yes, that checked kind of lino floor, and the open kitchen. Oh my gosh, yes, and the lights. Is it the little globe lights? It's got to have all of them. Otherwise, it just doesn't feel like a diner. But interesting. How is there anything that we're missing? Is there anything I'm missing? That's a really big personality of a vintage diner. Let me know. Let me know in the comments, guys. I do love, though. I think we do have a little bit of a love thing going on with what we perceive to be the American diners. Absolutely. The more the merrier. Bring more over. Guys, I hope you enjoyed watching that along with me. It's so very, very interesting. I can't believe it comes from the dining cart in a train and it never clicked. I never thought. Oh, I feel like a bit of a mug. Guys, take care of yourselves. Much love, and I will see you on the next video. Bye-bye for now.